My little first grade daughter is having a Chumash play early this morning, so I do have to change the schedule a little bit. As Hashem, next week I'm going to be in New York for a chasana. I'm traveling on the way to New York for a chasana, so I won't be able to do it. But Be'ez Hashem, we'll continue with Purim Halachas right after that. Okay? Now, this morning's topic, we entitled the share, Lost in the Rubble of Surfside. And this is a second share that we're giving on the topic of Hashavas Aveida. We gave one a little earlier this year, Lost in Borough Park. But Lost in Surfside, the Surfside Rubble, obviously is a totally different idea. You know, anyone here, anywhere in the Jewish world, but certainly those of us that live here in South Florida, those of us, you know, we're pretty close. It's a few mere minutes away. One could drive from right here and you could be at the site of that building collapse that happened half a year ago. And it's still something that's raw, something that's really hard to deal with. What's the message even of such a thing? How do we understand it? You know, it's not normal for a building to fall down in definitely any major country. Certainly around here, we haven't experienced, Baruch Hashem, such a thing. And, you know, of all the buildings in the world that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose to fall down, the fact that a building in Surfside, Florida, with a significant amount of the inhabitants of the building were Jewish, all the more so hits at us that, okay, you know, Hashem's obviously giving us a message. At the same time, we don't know exactly what the message is. It's a very tough chapter to deal with. Going back already months ago, people were asking me these shilas. What does one do with the items of Pi Halacha? Obviously, we'll get to that they involve the rabbis in many aspects of the search, rescue, and the dealings with Surfside, to the credit of the people involved. The Rabbanim, Jewish organizations were very involved. But if one would ask what to do with the lost items, things which were lost in the rubble of Surfside, halakhically speaking, what do we do with those items? That is the topic which I'd like to deal with this morning, and to dig in to the sugya of Hashavas Aveida. But I believe that the issues of returning lost objects in this very unique case. Now we know the general concept in Hashavas Aveida is if you have an item that has a siman, an identifiable means of returning it. So a Jew is responsible in normal circumstances to return it. If you find an item with a person's name, you can even have telephone numbers in it. So one would have a responsibility to return it. You know, we dealt with, okay, there might be certain circumstances where that wouldn't apply, but for the most part, items with a siman, you have to return. What makes this case obviously unique is when the building collapsed and all of a sudden everything got buried inside the building. The odds of finding anything, let alone things intact, is very, very slim. It's not great. Just the force of a big building, concrete, falling and destroying things. If a person had something in that building, there aren't great odds of him getting it back. But we're talking today about a case where there was something found. there was something found which is identifiable to an owner. Is there chiyuv to give that back? So I'd like to introduce is a concept in Baba Metzia called Zutil Shel Yom. And I had this discussion just last night, Hashavas Posek, and I put down this idea: would we classify the building collapsing on items? Would you compare that to the Gemara's case of Zuto Shel Yom? So let's read the Gemara. There's a Gemara that discusses this famous machlokas Aveida and Rava in a case of Yish Lo Midas, where a person picks up an item before the owner realizes he lost it. So there's a whole discussion about Yish Lo Midas, and the Gemara clarifies, where is the machlokas of Aveida and Rava. If you look in the middle of the Gemara on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis Baba Metzia, V'zuto Shel Yom Shel Shilshel Shel Nar, you find something basically washed away by the river. You're on a boat, you're kayaking, and something falls over. You lose something in the water, and it starts going downstream. So the Gemara says, "Avagav the ispe simin," even though there's a simin, there's an identifiable thing on it, still Rachmana Sharia, the Torah permits it. And that's not part of the machlokas Aveida and Rava. Rashi even makes a point, Rachmana Sharia of Afil Bas Liyada Motz Lifnei Yish. Even if it's found by the person before the owner gives up hope, nevertheless, it's still mutter in this case. Similarly, there's a Gemara in Chaf Daled Amud Aleph in Baba Metzia. We quoted this really for the second half of the Gemara later, once before. V'chein Yeshua ben Elazar Omer, Hamatzil min Ari, min Adov, min Nemer, person who saves something from a lion, a bear, a leopard, Nemer, right, Bardalis, min Zuto Shel Yom, Shel Shel Nar. Right? I said that last time. Can't do the joke again. So then it has also, you find something in a big public spot. So the Gemara says that all these cases are permitted. So seemingly, just at first glance, the case of a building collapsing on something should be no different than something being washed down sea. Something which a lion goes and grabs and runs into the forest. What's the chance you're going to get that back? Very, very slim. And therefore that fits into this category where the Torah says if you happen to find one of these items, even if it says clearly, Yosef Cohen on it, says a Jewish name, phone number, you would 100% Medina de the Gemara be allowed to keep that item. Yes?
Isn't there, the next step on this is that it's because the owner thinks it's hefker because they're never ever going to get it back?
Okay, so that's the next step which I do want to address. But simply put, l'chora, this case is comparable to our issue of the Surfside building collapse. You have a building collapsing, the odds, the situation, you're not going to find it. Now, what's the mechanism why the Torah permitted such a case? So, there's two diyukim I found people say. Firstly, let's start with that second Gemara I read. The end of that second Gemara, now it's categorizing multiple cases, but the end of the Gemara says the reason why it's permitted by all these cases, The Gemara seems to say the reason why it's permitted is because the owners give up hope. Similarly, one could make a diak in the earlier Gemara, the fact that Gemara grouped this together. I think your uncle Rabbi Moshe Goldberger and Kolo made such a diak, or he fought me on the diak. I forgot which way he was on, but maybe he fought. There is such a diak in the Gemara. The fact that Gemara brings us within the discussion of Yish Lomidas, Rashi makes a point of saying it's even if you got to your hands before Yish. So Pashup Shat in the juxtaposition in the Gemara is mashma. This is also working through the system of Yish. That it doesn't have to be a practical thing. The owner thought about it, gave up hope, made the object have efker. There's an idea of an assumption of Yish. If the rabbis assume, the Torah assumes, in such a case, a normal human being would give up hope, so then the halach is it's mutter. The Gemara even uses references later, even if the guy screams, you know what, I don't give up hope, I don't give up hope. Doesn't matter. The Torah has an assumption here that every person would give up hope, and even if you tell me this guy claims he didn't give up hope, either his das doesn't matter, or we really think that's what he really means and he's not telling the truth. But there's an assumption of Yish, according to Rashi and according to others, and that is why this case is mutter. For the record, though, there's another idea. There's for sure it's a Rashba, a Ramban, it might also be a Rambam, that they learn the mechanism of why this is mutter is not because of Yish. What do they do with the language of the Gemara at the end of Chav Daled? Okay, that have to be malcha a little bit. Neshav and Nizashim maybe is more going on the later cases than the earlier case. Not so great. Okay, the mashmos in the Gemara, yeah, that's also not so simple. But they learn that it's nothing to do with Yish. There's a flat out, the Torah gives a heter. There are certain circumstances, items, the Torah says is permitted. This is one of those items. Not because there's an assumption the person's giving up hope. That's a din Torah. Now we'll see, that might make for a nafkamina, perhaps later. So those are two ways to understand how it works. Zuto Shiyam either works because we're assuming the owner gives up hope, or even without the track of the owner giving up hope. An item in this scenario, in this situation, the Torah says, there's no din Hashavas Aveida there. Period. There are certain items you have to return. Other items you don't have to return. Gemara talks about an idea, let's say a zakin, ve'inel fi kvodo. You're walking down the street. Okay, let's say it like this. You're walking down the street of good morning, welcome. Person's walking down the street in Meir Sha'arim, nice Haredi rabbi, and he sees a smartphone lying there in the street. You know, there's two issues there. There, I mean that it might be ein lafi kvodo in that scenario to go and pick it up. It might also be a shayla pikuach nefesh. They could stone him. But that's an example. The Torah says Hashavas Aveida is a mitzvah in general. But if there's a scenario, it's a zakin, it's a talmid chacham, ve'ein lafi kvodo. It's not within his honor to return such an item. The olden days, I think, when my Rebbe taught it to me, is like a rabbi walking down the street and there's a big television, a big screen. It's not so bakavadik for him to be walking around holding a television in the street. Looks a little funny.
That might get stoned.
A dumb phone would be okay. Yes.
What about smartphone?
But if it can text, it's not.
But hold on.
What about
So
smartphone?
just like over there, that's considered a case which is exempt from the dinam of Hashavas Aveida. So similarly, you could say Zuta Shal Yam is. So to summarize, what we're saying to begin with is items found in the rubble in the Surfside building collapse are similar to this Gemara's case, Gemara's category of Zuto Shal Yam, something which is washed away by sea. And even if a person does find it, and there is an identifiable siman, the Gemara says, finders keepers. one would be allowed to keep it. So it means if you're volunteering on the site and you come across something, you can keep it. Let me just tell one more story. I was just went to vacation. I was taking a boat ride in Indian Creek, Fort Lauderdale, all the waters over there. And at one point, it seems there's a salt shortage. So they're pumping out the salt from this area over there, and they're taking it to beaches. So they have a whole big contraption. So the captain on the boat was saying, he knows the guys who work on the thing. He says, when they go through the salt, they pick it up, they find good things in the salt. He says, one guy, he told me the other day, he found some $10,000, diamond earring over there. Finders keepers. You lose it in the salt, right? A stomach that has a din in like Zuta Shal Yom.
Is it salt or sand?
Sand, sorry. Right. I'm thinking, right. Salt, water, sand, yeah. But, find it to keep it. Now, I want to transition to the Shulchan Aruch. That's the Gemara. Now let's talk about the Shulchan Aruch. Yes?
Ask one quick question beforehand. In terms of, particularly for the Rashba, in terms of things that somebody might find that might not be coveted to pick up and be carried around, what, just as a tiny spin on it, what if it's something that's like absolutely awesome for somebody to have, like a getchki that has somebody's name scrawled on it?
Right. That's interesting.
Or some kind of literature, spurious literature that's delivered in
Yeah. So I was just using that case as an example of the heter of the Torah.
So that would be included.
You're asking really a different issue. Is there a din of Hashavas Aveida in the items which you think a Jewish person shouldn't have? Let's say, Rabbi Berger will give a kashrus example. You find a McDonald's bag, and it says on it Cohen. Right?
No,
so, okay?
That's the name of the president of the shul.
Yeah. Right? It's probably a setup. Okay. So let's read the Shulchan Aruch.
So that will be awesome, you say.
Shulchan Aruch Hoshe Mishpat Siman Reish Nun Tes. Amatzah me'ari v'adov. Someone saved something from a lion, a bear. V'zutil shel yam. Okay? These cases of shel nahar. These cases where it's washed down the sea. Harei elu shelo. Afil about only v'tzaveach. The halacha is you're allowed to keep it. Even if the owner is screaming, give it back to me, I don't give up hope. It's mine. You see my name on it. You're 100% allowed to keep it. But the Ramah adds, Haga, Makom Makom, Tovi Yashar Lahachser, Commotion is bar b'sifhei. It's best to return it to him. And he references an earlier sif. This is a concept the Gemara talks about of Lefnim Mishur Sadin. There are cases where the Torah says you're allowed to keep this item. But nevertheless, if the guy is there, offers a siman, in this case, that it's his item, Tov Yasher, the best thing is, you want to go straight path, is to return it. So, okay, we're talking, here, let's blow up the case. Person comes across a nice Rolex in the rubble from Surfside. Even if it's got a few scratches, it's still worth a pretty penny. Simply you read through the halacha. Sounds like the halacha is you're allowed to keep it. But then you come across this Ramah.
It's probably worth more since it survived.
Okay, right. Perhaps.
Yeah.
You come across the Ramah. The Ramah says, Makom Makom Tov Yashar, to return it. So, okay, there's an idea of Lefnim Mishur Sadin. There's a very interesting halacha by Lefnim Mishur Sadin. I want to go into that because that's also its own share. The halacha actually qualifies. It says, you could look into account, the bank account, take into account the bank account of the finder and the loser. The idea of Lefnim Mishur Sadin does not apply if the finder is a pauper and the loser is a rich person. There's if the Torah says Medina, you're allowed to keep it, you shouldn't say, Lefnim Mishur Sadin, I'm going to give it back if you're a pauper and that person is a person of means. Very interesting halacha. Torah says, maybe this is the way Hashem is giving you money. But, okay, that's within the discussion of the Mashur Sadin. Now, I found two major achronim, the Beis HaLevi, Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, as well as the Trumas Hakri, that both take note that this comment of the Mashur Sadin was only made by the Ramah. Earlier, in a sif just before this, when the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch wrote the halachas, finding something actually lost in High Aliyah, in the Opalaka areas which are not Rov Jews, they're Rov Goyim, so you're allowed to keep it, even if it has a Jewish name on it. But there, the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber wrote, you should return him Lifnei Mashur Sadin. Here, the Mechaber doesn't write that. Mechaber leaves it out. So the Beis HaLevi makes a diak. Hey, how come Mechaber left this out? Now one could maybe say, what do you mean? Expects you to extrapolate and understand it. In these cases where there is a simon, you can give it back to an owner, even where it's mutter, you should give it back. That's how the Ramah takes it. The Ramah thinks it's Lifnei Mashur Sadin, commotion as far as Sifhei, just like it was written earlier. But these Achronim argue. They say, no, there's a difference between the cases. Granted, over there's an idea of Lifnei Mashur Sadin to return it, but by Zuto Shel Yom, something that's washed away by sea, where the odds are nil that you're going to get it back, such a case, there's no concept of Lifnei Mashur Sadin. So that would make for a little tricky circumstance. The Ramah for sure is saying that you should give it back. But, this might be a nafkamina. Who found it, an Ashkenazi or a Sephardi? Who's working at the site? If nice Ashkenazic origins, you clearly have a Ramah, you work at the site, you find that Rolex, you should give it back. You should, unless a certain circumstance that this is Hashem's way of giving you money, but outside of that, you should return it. Though the Mechaber might be arguing on this thing. And it could be a Sephardi posek would say, if he knows this Beis HaLevi, I don't know if he knows the Beis HaLevi, but if he knows the Beis HaLevi, this Trumas Sakri, then there is room to say that this case is different. This case might be an absolute heter. This case might go beyond the ideas of Yish. And in this case, there might be totally mutter. Yes?
In this case, who would be returning it to?
Good question, right? So I didn't specify in my cases, my made-up cases, what are we talking about? So really it gets into an interesting halacha, right? Is there a din of Hashavas Aveida to Yarshim, to heirs? Because let's say the person perished in the towers, but there are heirs. This might get into an issue of who's considered an heir, a Yoresh, according to the Torah. Yeah. But we could also be talking about cases of where there are survivors and they have, claims. So yeah, for sure. So both of these things would matter in the circumstance. Okay, you found it in the rubble. Me'ikar din seems pashab shot, you'd be allowed to keep it. But at the same time, there might be an Indian of the Lifnei Mashur Sadin to give it back. Now I want to throw one more curveball into the circumstance. I did some research to see how are they organizing the things. They did find things at the site in Surfside. What's practically going on with the stuff that they found? So it seems from the New York Times articles, Miami Herald, what I was able to put together, I didn't speak to anyone in charge of the site, but what is reported in the papers is supposedly everything that was found in the site of value, they're cataloging, categorizing, and they're looking to see to give back to the owners /sell/deal with. Now, the government is taking an active role in the items at site, which really means of a person going through them and going through the rubble and finding something. Sounds like, I don't know if it's an actual law, actual statute, or is that the process which they set up in that circumstance, that they are expecting those items to be centrally located and returned. So that brings up a whole other angle. Really two other angles. I'll start with what I call the second first. Firstly, where does the din of Dina de Malchusa Dina fit in terms of Hashavas Aveida? The Torah says you're allowed to keep something in this case. But what about secular law? Where does that fit in? That's one question. And the other question, I was also discussing this with the Posik, saying, they are sifting through the stuff and people, and they're finding things. He says, would that preclude then it being categorized as a case of Zuto Shal Yam? Because maybe then the owner wouldn't give up hope because, hey, somebody might find it. So let me deal with that second question first. In terms of that second question, hey, the fact that they're searching the site and they are finding things, is that a reason the owner wouldn't give up hope? So, firstly, if we said it before that there's a major machlokas, Rishonim, how to understand Zuto Shal Yam. Is Zuto Shal Yam functioning based on the owner giving up hope? Or is it an automatic din if in this circumstance the Torah says it's mutter? If it's the latter, so seemingly it wouldn't matter in the minds of the person, he wouldn't give up hope because people might find it. The Torah says in this circumstance, unless you're going to try to argue, it's no longer Zuto Shal Yam. It's hard to say. It's not Zuto Shal Yam. It's the odds of finding, I'm sure there's much more things they didn't find than what they found.
It will become again
Huh?
at some point.
It will what?
It will become Zuto Shal Yam again at some point when
Right.
the process is
It's going through
completed.
waves,
That's
right?
now or
Right. So that's tricky. So I would assume Pashas is still a din of Zuto Shal Yam for sure if you say Zuto Shal Yam is an outright heter. But even if you tell me that Zuto Shal Yam is based on a person's yish, again, it's presumed yish. I would think that most people in that circumstance would give up hope, even though there's a chance, that something we found, that is really a very interesting issue of yish. And as if a person, we're talking about a case, this has come up a little bit when you learn the Parakeh and Messias. The average person will give up hope. But you have a person, like, it's just a 1 in 10 million chance, I'm still not giving up hope. Does that constitute a situation where there's no yish? What do we say in general? The whole din of yish is a din which is predicated on normal assumptions of people. So I don't know. Yes?
It's kind of like a steak. The amount of stuff that was found is a fraction of a percent of everything
Yes.
that was there. So you're talking about something that's like, for all intents and purposes, buckle to begin with, and then out of all the people who lived in the building, maybe 1 or 2 of those items is
Yes, the odds are still very, very slim. And yeah, I would think it's still very not pashut. But hold on, I want to jump to the other area, and I see this type of share. I have to leave, I have to end pretty soon, but I'm going to save a few minutes for everyone's questions want to come up right after. So the other area which I said is very interesting is the halachas of Dina de Malchusa Dina. So I'd like to share with you that same Ramah that we were reading before talks about it. So let's see that inside. Again, the Mechaber talked about Zuto Shal Yam being mutter. Then the Ramah added that it's Tovi Yashar, it's best to do Hashavas Aveida even in that case. Now he writes, "Va'af lagav de medina in chayv mahachsa ba'avedas elu." Meikar din, you don't have to return these lost objects. Im gazar hamelech, if the king decreed, o bezdin chayv lahachser mikoach dina de malchusa, lahefka bezdin hefker. If the government says that you have to return it, then you would have to return it utilizing these dinim, the concept of dina de malchusa dina. So the simple understanding in the Shulchan Aruch sounds like, okay, if you have a case, it sounds like this. From Torah law, we would classify the rubble of Surfside, Zutel Shal Yam. There's no difference, lost at sea or lost in the rubble. It's the same thing. But if the Dina de Malchusa Dina, if the what's it called? If the law, it sounds even the king decrees, even in this case, that you should return it, then the halacha is you got to return it. So that would seem that anything you find there, regardless of the whole first part of the share, just go with whatever Miami-Dade says. If they say you have to return it, then you have to return it. But I came across a very interesting Ksos HaChoshen, I believe it's also a Shach, that makes the following classification. And I also spoke to Poskim about this. You know, you look in Jewish newspapers, the back of the Ated, the Jewish press, right? You might find there, lost, right? You find on the street post in Lakewood, right?
Yeah.
People have signs up, lost and this.
Found in Borough.
Right. Why do we always do that? Why don't we always just give over everything we have to the police station? Let them deal with it. So first of all, it's not so pashut, there are halachas, dina malchus dina, where they're doing, what something could be defined as a din. If you don't trust them that they're going to really give back the owner, it's just going to sit in some vat forever. My poor father-in-law, one time he was flying, and he forgot his notebook in the pocket in front. A lot of Kedusha, in the pocket in front of him. He felt bad about it. He wasn't miyayish right away. So he went, I was in JFK, LaGuardia, he went to the lost and found. When he went to the lost and found, he was miyayish.
That's you right there.
Right? You see a room, a warehouse, with unlimited amount of forget about notebooks. How am I ever going to find this? I don't know. Maybe they should organize Talmidim in the yeshiva to go to the JFK's, thing. Everyone to go through. I mean, those. Unfortunately, I assume there's a turnaround. They burn these things probably. They get rid of them. This is years ago. What a shame. But the way the Ksos learns Pshat in Dina Malchus Adina is very interesting. He says it's tied together with Lifnim Mishur Sadin. The only time we say that one has to strictly follow the law of the land is only if it's a situation where Lifnim Mishur Sadin you would have to return it. Since anyway Lifnim Mishur Sadin you should return it, so then also you should follow the Dina Malchus Adina and give it back. But what happens in the case of where Lifnim Mishur Zadin you wouldn't have to return it? Then you wouldn't have the Dina de Malchus Adina either. So the nafkamina that we said before, whether Lifnim Mishur Zadin applies by Zuta Shal Yam, would come into play. If you learn like the simple reading of the Ramah, that something washed away at sea, even though midin, you're allowed to keep it, but as long as you're not a pauper, halacha is you should return it. And okay, you have to return it, and there also would be dina de malchus dina considerations. But if you say like the Beis HaLevi and others, that no, in such a case, you don't have to return it. Zut shel shiyam is different than every other case. It's totally mutter. So then in such a case, one would be allowed to keep it and wouldn't have to take into consideration the ordinance, says that we should put back lost items. Just want to end with a story that I know of. I know one of the families that Muslim did lose a family member at the site. Obviously, tragedy beyond tragedies. One of the most amazing things that gave the family a lot of chizuk was within the rubble. I believe it was actually the IDF, team They found Sidurim and other Sfarim from this family. Inside, it's pretty eerie, but inside those Siddur, that Chumash, you get your first Chumash, you get your first Siddur at the yeshiva, they put a stamp and they give you your own thing. And it had the name of the family inside that Siddur, inside the Chumash. And this family took this as a very, chizuk from Shemayim. Not all is lost. The Siddur, the name is still in there. So there's a lot to returning a lost item to a family. It could mean a lot to them. And, I'm sure the Ramah would say, even though Me'ikar Adin, you want to be able to keep that Rolex. But you don't know many times what the mitzvah Hashavas Aveida could do by returning that lost item, Tov Yashar, to do such a thing. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Again, next week, I'll be away, Bezos Hashem, but we will continue we have 2 weeks, Bezos Hashem, before Purim. Thank you very much. Yes, very important. Thank you so much. This wonderful share was sponsored by Ed Zaslow in memory of his father, Maurice Zaslow, Moshe Chaim and Sri Hirsch, and it was just his 6th year site on Shushan Purim Katan. The Shabbat should have an Aliyah, and the schus of all the Torah should go to that.
Amen.
Okay, thank you very much.